I can hear myself over the speaker. Yeah. Hi guys, can you hear me? Yeah. So we will be starting shortly. Firstly, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to invite Henry and Alfonso Somorin. Please take your seat. Uh, so we are exactly on time. Firstly, welcome everyone. It's very good morning to you all. This is the day two of the COP, but it doesn't feel like day two. I think it's a long way to go. And thank you for the Independent Hub. My name is Sandeep Sanming Rai. I'm the global lead for WWF and IFRC partnership on nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So I'm part of the WWF International team under the climate energy practice. So today in WWF we are saying it's the Africa Day, and definitely our event is on from promise to practice, ramping the climate adaptation finance to Africa. So we are really focusing for the Africa region. We have great panelists. We are waiting some more panelists to join. It's really early, so I think people are coming in. So before I will quickly give some background in terms of what we are really doing in this particular event. So the event we are really trying to focus for the Africa in terms of, though the Africa is one of the vulnerable continent, but what we have seen is the funding going in Africa is drastically low, and so since this COP, what we all know is a finance COP. So definitely, finance is a big issue in the agenda. Whether we talk about the adaptation fund, the doubling of the adaptation finance, or talking about the NCQZ, the worst I would say acronyms, the new qualitative quantifying goal. Well, but so we will really unpacking some of those elements, and we have the great, I would say, panelists in the floor, and some more are coming. And so I would like to introduce Henry Newfield, who is Chief Scientific Editor for UNEP CCA Africa. He will be really unpacking the great work that what the Adaptation Gap Report has really showed. So that will be really good and great to have you, sir. And similarly, our next panelist is Olufunso Somorin, who is a regional principal officer, climate change and green growth program under the Africa Development Bank, and he will be really highlighting some of the work that what Africa Development Bank is doing for the Africa, the great work that the Africa Development Bank is coming forward. And we do have two more speakers who will be joining us shortly. One of our speakers is Kapili Sachili, who is the Executive Chief of Staff and Strategy for Absa Bank Africa, who is a private bank. So definitely for a person, we also need the private financing, and there is also a strong role of the private financing. And lastly, definitely we also hear some of the youth issues, youth voice. She got some medical issues, so she will be joining a little bit late. But I hope that she will be on. She will be for the event today. So. So we have 1 hour time, so definitely we will have some Q&A to the panelists. Then we will open the floor. We will take some questions from the floor. Then and we will give the final remarks to the panelists, and I will try to summarize the event, and we will close the event after that. So with that flow and everything, I would really like to start this program. And once I'm going to welcome. So maybe I will ask the first question to Henry in terms of, let's say, what we have seen in, let's say, UNEP gap report in 2023, there is a lot of, let's say, adaptation finance gap that is needed for the world to build climate resilience, and in the range of, let's say, on an average 300 billion per year that we need funding for adaptation, right? But you have come out with a new, let's say, 2024 adaptation finance gap report. So from your point of view and from your research, how significant is the current, I would say, financing gap in climate adaptation, particularly focusing in Africa? And can you be able to highlight some of those elements, Henry?
Yes, thank you, Sandeep. So glad to be here. And I think it's a timely event to talk about adaptation finance for the African continent. And I'd be glad to add some elements that we have looked at in this year's adaptation gap report. In addition to what Sandeep was just saying. Last year, we estimated the adaptation finance gap to be in the range of, the numbers haven't changed all that much. We're still talking about 200 billion to 400 billion on average, depending on the approach that we use. And what has changed is the amount of funding flows that have increased from 2021 to 2022, our latest number, significantly, from 21 billion to 28 billion. That's the global funding. So if you look at the difference, we're somewhere in the range of 10 to 15, like 1 to 10, 1 to 15, which it means that we need a lot more adaptation finance. That's the first message. We're still really, really short on adaptation finance in total. But, and here's the but, we also in this year's report looked much more closely at sort of the distribution of funding, at the ways through which adaptation finance can be bridged, incentives and instruments. And what I can say about the adaptation finance gap for Africa is, first of all, the needs and the cost estimates, depending on how you do it, are somewhere in the range of 12 to 14% for sub-Saharan Africa. And if you add North Africa and the Middle East, we're around 20% of adaptation finance needs. If you break that down, we're talking about 40 to 80 billion US dollars per year. That's what we need for Africa every year. And what we're getting is around 10 to 12 billion. And that is because nearly 40% of the adaptation finance flows actually goes to Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, but also Northern Africa and the Middle East. So what we can say is that, of course, there is a gap, which is 1 to 4 or 1 to 8, but it's significantly lower than the global gap, right? So the funding is going in the right direction, I think, because there is an overemphasis of adaptation finance going to African nations. What we also know is that there is a differentiation we have to make between concessional and non-concessional finance. And that ratio has been roughly it's changed significantly last year because there was a significant increase in concessional finance from 2021 to 22. So we're talking about a third that goes into non-concessional finance and 2/3 going into concessional finance. And here again, the message is that more of the concessional finance is going to African nations. So that means the poorest countries are receiving conditions when it's about loans that are preferential. I think that is also a good news. That said, I think we still need to invest more strongly in grants for African nations, particularly the least developed countries or small island developing states, because they're the ones that need the support to the greatest amount. And that is also because when it comes to all sorts of loan systems, even concessional loans, the beneficiaries ultimately pay for the adaptation benefits. And in many cases, the countries that are already indebted in Africa and other places, they struggle when there is a climate impact. And that means that their debt loads will increase more significantly when they try to increase their adaptation finance or climate finance more generally. The conditions which they can get on the marketplace are disadvantageous. And in the end, there is a greater flow of finance to the developed world than vice versa. And that is also this is on a global level. I can't break this down by by countries or continents, but what we know is that with the exception, when we take China away, debt interest, not the debt, but debt interest is greater than the total adaptation finance needs global. That's a significant amount of money, and I think international finance reform can do a great deal in improving the conditions here and reducing the challenges that poor nations face when they try to invest in adaptation to protect themselves against the increasing climate impacts. And I'll stop here because I think that's enough for now. There's more I can say later. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Henry. And the point that you highlighted about the debt interest is really, let's say, remark is really shocking. And one of the what we are hearing in the negotiation process is about how the debt relief can be one of the key instrument, in, especially for the, let's say, vulnerable countries like, or the continent like Africa. So yeah, I think that's a great point. So let's see how the negotiation moves forward. And also just to add on, even if you look the IPCC report, the sixth assessment report, it talks about, let's say, around 7% of the total climate finance is going for adaptation. So it's like you said, let's say 1/10 or even 1/12 of the total climate finance going for the adaptation, and most of them are, let's say, not much the private finance. So I think with that on the note, well, I would really like to invite Olufunso Somorin from the Africa Development Bank. Firstly, thank you so much for the Africa Development Bank for taking the leadership and supporting our Africa continent as a whole. But I really want to ask some of the points in terms of the great work that you do from the Africa Development Bank and some of the specific initiatives. What are some of the specific initiatives from the bank that is really trying to address the adaptation gap in Africa? So can you please be able to unpack some of those?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I have to say thank you for inviting me and for inviting the bank to this very timely conversation. And I think I really do want to commend the leadership of WWF and all the partners represented here for raising this conversation. It's very important, not because it's necessarily new. We've been talking about finance on the broader scale, more specifically adaptation finance in the African context for a while. And I think it's important for us to reflect on what are the core issues on the continent. So number one, and I want to reflect on those in the light of what the bank is doing. Number one, we need to do a lot of work in aligning the climate goals and development goals in our countries. It's fundamental. We're not going to have the luxury to do adaptation to climate change on the one hand and development work on the other hand. We don't have that luxury. We have to build a convergence of climate goals and development goals in Africa. And so the approach by the bank is that we mainstream climate change in all our development operations, in all our development policies. That mainstreaming is very critical. Think of a country that is able to create a very robust context-specific tools and methodologies where climate resilience or adaptation broadly is part of every ministry and is part of every development planning. What that helps you to do or achieve is that on the one hand, it can help you to mobilize, as you mobilize development finance, you can achieve climate goals. And the same vein, as you mobilize climate goals, you can also achieve development finance. Because for me, adaptation is a climate-informed development. And that is fundamental, that we create a high-level linkage, both on policy level and operational level. And what the bank did is, together with all the MDBs, we decided that we're going to mainstream climate change in all our operations. And then we're going to go deeper to account for every activity within every project and the cost of those activities, particularly those that are consistent with adaptation or mitigation. So today, on average, the bank will approve about $10 billion worth of investment every year. Out of that $10 billion, more than half of that usually 53% for 2023 went into climate action. So that is 5.8 billion out of the 10.6 that we got approved in 2023. And that is significant because if at the bank we don't have climate change projects, we have climate-informed development projects. And by doing that, AFDB alone is able to channel $5.8 billion in 1 year to climate action. Within that, we also make sure that there is a parity between adaptation and mitigation. Most development finance institutions are when you look at where their resources are going, it's very much into mitigation. But AFDB over the years, and I'm sure many of you in this room are aware about our deliberate approach in the African context to prioritize deliberately adaptation. So about almost 60% of that 5.8 went into adaptation program. And so it didn't start with the money. It started with the policy and the tools where we place emphasis on the mainstreaming. That's the first part. The second thing we need to do also from experience as well is to understand the complex nature of adaptation and be able to relate with it. It is possible for you to do one project worth $200 million and mitigation project, and that will still be considered to be a small ticket size. But you cannot consider a $200 million adaptation project a small ticket size. In fact, on average, most adaptation projects in Africa, they're barely $2.6 million on average in ticket size, whereas mitigation projects on average are about $18 million. So that already tells you that the nature of adaptation projects. They're very small, they're very localized, they're very sector specific, and that means as well that we need a layer where you are able to aggregate small projects together so that they can reach a level that they are investment ready or bankable. I'm not a fan of using the word bankable, but for sake of peace, let's use the word bankable today. But basically, the whole idea is understand the complex structure and nature of adaptation, and then find an entry point that helps you to get around it. So we aggregate projects. So what we've done, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we created what we call Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, AAAP, Africa Acceleration Adaptation Program. And the whole idea was aggregate projects together, understand the ones that need some facility, such as small grants, to do better preparation and scalable, and then find financial structures around it. Our target is to do $25 billion worth of investment in a period of 5 years. We started in 2021 to at the end of 2025. I can report today that we've done more than $10 billion. So we're not there yet, but not up to our target, but at least we've been able to learn a lot of lessons. And I imagine that post-2025, those lessons can help us scale further. The third point, and I'm very mindful of time, it's also so the second point, it's important that a programmatic approach is very important to adaptation, as opposed a specific project by project. And what we have done with AAAP is a programmatic approach to adaptation. The third point is also to understand this. Today in Africa, on average, 90% of most adaptation projects are either financed by concessional loans or grants. So they are basically two instruments. On the other hand, mitigation in the same continent, more than 11 different financial instruments have been used for mitigation. And the best way I like to present it, think of yourself coming into a city to probably live in, and there are only 2 restaurants in that city. One restaurant has got 2 food items on its menu. Another restaurant has got at least 11 food items on the menu. Now ask yourself as a person, which restaurant will you naturally gravitate towards? And that is the whole notion. Mitigation have been tested on the continent with multiple instruments, so even non-traditional investors and donors are playing a role in the mitigation space, however, adaptation. So what are we proposing? I think one of the things we're doing, and I like the conversation because it is promise to practice. And the practice is that we need to develop new thinking around new instruments for adaptation. We need to find new financial instruments that can help us, whether it's not just concessional loan, but also resilience bonds, or low-priced um, debt, form equity guarantees, risk-sharing facilities, swaps. We need to test run all of these type of instruments for adaptation, and more importantly, we need to deploy them at scale. When we have multiple instruments, we also have a chance to be able to scale up the numbers that you have just referred to. I'll keep it here for now, but those are some of 3 points from my own experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think so, Maureen. I think you really highlighted in terms of the let's say the scale of the funding that is going in the Africa compared to where we were maybe 20 years down the road, for example, and also we cannot really distinguish between we cannot divorce the development versus adaptation. That needs to be going hand in hand. I think that's really good. And also the point I like about, I also am not in the favor of what bankable, especially on the adaptation part, because as we see, and I come from Nepal, which is one of the vulnerable country, and we see a lot of climate disaster. And how you gonna bankable those disasters? It's really hard to do that. So, but just going with the flow, I think let's agree with the bankable terminology, but especially the bankable is much more, let's say, viable in the mitigation space. So, but and it's really good that when I started this journey on climate negotiation almost 2 decades ago, adaptation was a stepchild, and it still is a stepchild. But slowly, the progress we have seen a lot. But sometimes I feel that there are many agenda items on adaptation, so that is somehow a little bit undermining the importance of the adaptation. And we, as a vulnerable country, I think we need to really unite that. So before I go for the next round of the question, is there any question from the floor that you want to raise or ask? Okay. If not, then you can keep your question yourself. We can go for next round later on. So maybe then, Henry, I will just come back to you in terms of the recent, let's say, the gap report that you were really instrumental in terms of coming it out. So is there any kind of some of the specific recommendations in your particular report that really provides how to bridge the gap of adaptation finance in Africa, that what, let's say, Maureen was also highlighting before?
Yes, thank you. So just before answering your question, we also, because there is this big difference in terms of the funding going to mitigation versus adaptation, we have to acknowledge that mitigation needs a whole lot more funding. The gap isn't, the emissions gap is in the funding gap is in the range of $1 to $3 trillion per year for now, for this decade. The investment that we need to make in mitigation now is enormous, so we can't forget that mitigation really needs a lot of money at this point, because we will all benefit from that later on as adaptation costs will rise with increasing climate impacts, and it will not rise linearly, it will rise exponentially. Yes, so with every fraction of a degree that temperature rises, climate impacts accelerate, because they are complex, they are cascading, compounding, and transboundary. So there's a lot of things that we have to consider here, sort of the background of it, just as a basis. And I really liked the idea of mainstreaming climate development, or development and climate adaptation, into a resilience framework, as the African Development Bank is doing. However, because that is addressing the underlying issue of reducing vulnerability. So, when we look at climate risks, it's a function of exposure and vulnerability to climate hazards. Just very simply spoken, that's the two elements of climate risks that we need to address. And by reducing climate risk, we are addressing the problems that people face on the ground to manage these risks, which will then translate into impacts. So by mainstreaming climate change into development, we're addressing the vulnerability component, increasing education, healthcare, SWAT. These things improve people's resilience to all sorts of stresses, not only climate risks, but they also improve people's resilience against climate change. That's the development component of it. But there is also the exposure component of it, and that must be addressed specifically through early warning systems, climate information systems, specific breeding in agriculture, water management for drought, for floods. These things reduce exposure to climate hazards. These things are not development. This is specific investment in climate adaptation. So we need both. We need an increase in the development component to improve vulnerability or reduce vulnerability. We need an increase in specific measures to reduce exposure to climate hazards. So that's just two things I wanted to say about that. And now, one other element I didn't mention before, and which is also making things a lot more difficult when implementing adaptation actions on the ground, what we find is that adaptation action is woefully poor. We assessed 170 projects from the Green Climate Fund. So these are all funds, GCF, Adaptation Fund, and the JEF funds. These are all funds specifically addressing adaptation, and what we find is that half of them on average, roughly half of these projects, didn't meet the expectations in terms of the results, and there's an overlap, there's a difference, but half of them roughly are also not sustainable long-term without project funding. That is, if you don't invest in the right theory of change, if you don't invest in something that has a life post-project, we can be sure that it's not sustainable and it's not going to last, and we need to change that. We need to improve our projects, and we can do that by improving the underlying enabling conditions, institution building, governance structures, transparency and accountability, more adaptive management, and very importantly, we need to build our projects much more strongly together with the populations that we're trying to reach on the ground. Because adaptation is so local, we need to make sure that those that we're trying to reach are invested and co-developing the project from the beginning, from the very beginning to the very end, so that they own the projects, that they are part of the development process. And last but not least, we need to increase the monitoring and evaluation approaches that we have, which are poor, in order to say whether or not we're making progress towards our objectives. And I don't want to add too much more to what he just said about the instruments, and I like the analogy of 2 courses versus multiple courses that you have access to in the restaurants in your place, because that is exactly the recommendation that our adaptation gap report brings this year. Like, it's necessary to bring in new financial instruments and approaches, performance-based climate resilient grants, resilience credits, debt for adaptation swaps, payments for ecosystem services, work for taxation, and resilience bonds are just those that we name in the report. In addition, we need to enhance a number of enabling conditions for the public sector and for the private sector. So the private sector has a hard time engaging in adaptation because it's not as bankable. There is no easy return on investment. That is, even when there is an interest in or a possibility for the private sector to invest, 2/3, just on the side, 2/3 of adaptation action is actually not interesting for the private sector. This is something that the public sector has to invest in more strongly because they have public goods characteristics or they're in non-market sectors. Where there is a marketplace, where there is an opportunity for the private sector to invest, the public sector must improve the accessibility and the ability of the private sector to engage. That is, to reduce the risk of investment, de-risk investments, blended finance. Those are the things that need to happen in order to engage the private sector more strongly in the areas where they have a role to play. And in addition, the public sector must invest more strongly in transformational adaptation, in strategic adaptation, because just addressing the low-hanging fruit is not going to cut it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. And I like the point that you mentioned about uh, there's so many the new instruments that can be used for the adaptation action on the ground, and also about the sustainability of the adaptation process. I really like that point of view, and maybe I just want to pick your points on the sustainability issue. Is the sustainability issue is due to the capacity of the individual, let's say country or community not being able to address, or is climate change adaptation is, let's say, is so changing because it entirely depends upon the mitigation target? Is is there any correlation that you see in your report about the mitigation targets versus the adaptation activity that you build? Because what I feel, and based on our little experience in WWF, we are always chasing the ultimate goal of building resilience while the mitigations, while the impact is much more increasing on day-to-day basis. And sometimes we really don't have those primary data to understand what the future impact will be in certain geographical locations or ecosystem, let's say in 2-degree temperature rise scenario. So how do you see those elements, and have you ever looked into those elements? Just to want to highlight that.
Sure, but I don't want to hog the mic. He's going to get more questions too, I'm sure. So I think there's a point to what you're saying. Of course, there is the sort of, we're catching up with climate reality all the time. Climate is changing. And by mainstreaming development into, or mainstreaming climate change into development action, there is a possibility of addressing these future climate risks more strongly. That is, looking at the future climate in a specific location is important, and that is part of the reason why project implementation is poor. And I think there is a reason to answer why they're not sustainable in such a way as well. But I think the bigger reason why projects are not sustainable has to do with governance and poor institutions. Poor governance, lack of institutions, and enabling conditions to maintain projects, and I think the lack of engaging with the beneficiaries of these actions from the very beginning, being very adaptive of what they need, rather than having some kind of idea at the outset. You know, I've done many, many projects. I know that what you think is going to work never works. It's going to be different. So you got to adapt while you're implementing. You got to make sure that the people you're working with, they're on board. They take this. They own this. So I think that's my hunch, because we did not look at this question specifically in the assessment. It wasn't possible to look at the causes for not achieving sustainability or achieving the anticipated project outcomes. That said, so addressing those elements, looking more closely into the future is critical, however, when it comes to sectors that have longer life cycles. When it comes to agriculture, we do not need to look beyond 10 years, because agriculture is an annual business. People adapt, they use new seeds, and we need to build and breed these new seeds. That is part of what we do in the agricultural, the CGIAR and National Agricultural Research Organizations, regional organizations. They do that, and that is important. But, sectors like infrastructure, energy, water infrastructure, or even forestry, they go beyond a decade. And when it comes to that, you do need to look at future climate risks much more strongly. And lastly, I want to say that transformational adaptation is different from incremental adaptation, just changing things, changing the seeds or slightly modifying your planting dates. These are, incremental changes. They take you so far. But I mean, if you want to think about what the population in place X, which is a lowland, very prone to flooding, is going to do in 20 years, I think it's probably not going to be agriculture, or it's going to be a very different kind of agriculture. Thinking through what at every location, how change can happen, I think is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. I like the point that you are talking about the fit for the purpose. It is really a key word, I think, in whenever we talk about adaptation. And there are certain principles that some of us are lobbying, especially the locally led principles. So those needs to be really applicable. And whenever we do with any kind of adaptation activities, it needs to be either incremental or transformative, depending upon the sector that you're really working with. I really like the example that you gave about the rice crop, that it can be incremental, but for the ecosystem services, those kind of things, it needs to be transformative. I think that's really good. And I hope this issue will really come up in the negotiation process as well. It's there in the IPCC report, but whenever we talk about the transboundary adaptation issue in the negotiation process, is always, let's say, not so welcoming by the parties because of so many other geopolitical issues. So maybe moving on, maybe so Maureen, I would really ask, when Henry talked a little bit about the innovating financing, I would say things before. So maybe I really want to ask, from the African Development Bank, what are some of the innovative financing, I would say, tools and approach that you are either suggesting or either incorporating within the portfolio that will really try to address those adaptation gap, finance gap for the Africa? So
Thank you. Very good question indeed. So first, it's possible to identify as a starting point what are those entry points for innovation, and what exactly are we innovating? Are we trying to innovate the instrument, like the type of financial instrument? Are we looking at the policy framework actually in the country, or are we even looking at the system around the delivery of adaptation actions and adaptation finance on the ground? So for the bank, the starting point is to identify those entry points. So for us, it's one of the entry points for us is trying to innovate the system. And one of the things that we do is constantly have this dialogue with the government based on their NDC's priorities, but also based on their interests, to constantly look at or face out the idea that you want to do a climate change project, as a standalone, rather to embrace an integrated approach and to help them understand the tools and the entry points in how climate change can be part of either the national development plans or of the country, or even medium-term action plans across different sectors. So it's not rocket science, but that engagement is very fundamental. In fact, you could go a step further to help them develop a budget targeting approach where you can unpack what percentage of the total annual budget is going to climate action on the ground, and be able to understand if it's very effective in delivering adaptation outcomes in the country. But obviously as well, the financial institutions have a role to play in adaptation. So you said a point that I thought was very important, and that is the fact that by sheer measure, mitigation finance is going to be higher than adaptation finance because of the goal that we have set for ourselves. And it's an ambitious goal. What is happening is that even in countries that have clearly stated in their NDCs that adaptation is our priority, even in those poorest of countries, even the climate finance flows in those countries is still mitigation. And that's a bit of a paradox, because if finance flows along the line of value, finance moves in the direction of what you place policy value on, then the question is, we have placed policy value on adaptation as a priority. Our NDCs have shown that, but unfortunately through operations. But we know why. We basically know why that is that. So what we do in our context is to understand how do we bring our financial institutions, particularly domestic financial institutions on the continent, to play a role in the adaptation space. Now, and I like the point that, and it's also another paradox, that almost three-quarters of adaptation projects are very much within the domains of public goods and ultimately may not be attractive for private sector. But these adaptation projects are happening in sectors that form the bulk of the economies of this country. So how is it possible that adaptation in agriculture is not bankable for a private sector, but a private sector person is operating in agriculture value chains in the country? There is an information asymmetry where climate vulnerability and the interests of climate actions have not been integrated in the private sector decision-making apparatus. And that is something that we thought we could do. So we created what we call Africa Financial Alliance on Climate Change. And basically, AFAC, the idea is bring the private sector, bring the financial institutions on the continent together, help them understand both the vulnerability and the opportunity side of climate change, help them understand how should they consider the climate risk in their decision-making frameworks, and not necessarily they get, not interested, or, rather find the access to information that they need in order to be able to embrace it differently. You could unlock a quantum of capital with domestic resources. Today in Africa, the amount of capital sitting in our pension funds, in our commercial banks, in all of our, we consider them dominant capital in a way, it's about $2.4 trillion in Africa, $2.4 trillion in terms of, our financial institutions. If you unlock just 1% of that for adaptation, and I'm not being ambitious by going 10%, just 1% of that, you're talking about $24 billion annually, just from African financial institutions. But they don't have the information, and that itself is innovation. We must be able to innovate the access to information that helps private sector level decision-making and credit risk analysis program. The third point is the instrument themselves. We can actually innovate the instrument, and we can test new instruments. So today, we now hear things like resilience bonds on the continent. Today, we're working with institutions, but also to see how do we do debt swaps. So we have a number of guarantee instruments, and we're able to put guarantee instruments in place, find a way to blend it with our concessional loans that is available, and ultimately crowd in private capital to undertake a number of projects, even in adaptation. We don't have time to go through a lot of examples. The final point is, we're not going to always be successful where every time we need $2 million, we run to somebody. If we're able to innovate by creating a fund structure that you can work with through intermediaries, some projects cannot come to AFDB because of their ticket sizes, which are too low, but AFDB is able to pull resources together from other partners in a fund, and then have this fund managed by intermediaries who are able to do small ticket sizes. So I'll keep it there, but it's good to understand what are the entry points for innovation, and be very specific about the type of innovation needed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, so Maureen. I think that's really good, and I can see there's a lot of work going in Africa, and under the leadership of Africa Development is ongoing. So maybe I will take a few questions before you go, Alfonso. So because you're going right now. Okay, then. Okay. Okay, can you just one particular? Okay, you're going to actually. Okay, then maybe before you go, then what's your expectation from this COP29, especially on the adaptation finance, and how that will really try to address the adaptation gap, finance gap in Africa? So, what's your expectation for COP29? Just few points. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very tough question because COP, we've been here multiple times, so we've learned to manage our expectations. But I'm hoping that we can we can take some bold actions when it comes to making resources available, but more importantly as well, both from the capital, from the side of developed countries, but it's also very important that even for adaptation, we can look into a lot of efficiency on the ground. We will not always have enough money. Let's agree. But for every amount of money that we manage, let's use it well. Let's demonstrate result. So we have to speak to both the demand side of capital and the supply side of capital as well. So it's a new reform partnership where we look at finance and look at the partnership around delivery, around quality, but also around progress and results. Thank you. Forgive me, but I have to go. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Oliver Chai, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think moving on, I see a question over here. So yeah, okay, two questions. So maybe I will just hand over to.
Thank you very much. This is Popular Gentle. I am from Nepal. I work for Climb Adapt in Nepal, based in Nepal. Being a national of the most vulnerable country, even concessional or non-concessional loan is not acceptable for me, being a national. It should be in the form of grant, and it should be in the form of social and environmental justice. So that is the position, that should be the position of the most vulnerable countries, that I would like to say, being a national of the vulnerable country. The second point, another dimension of adaptation finance that has not much discussed is who has access to adaptation finance. Recently, I carried out adaptation finance research based in Nepal and also in Pacific. The findings are very critical. The access to finance is up to mostly to the donor-funded development organizations or national organizations who can accredit it to the GCF or other organizations, other financial mechanisms. While it is very hard to access climate finance for the local institutions or national institutions, the rule of the game and the complexity, it is really hard to access finance. So I think this should be discussed very much. So as a result, what donor-funded programs are doing in Nepal is they are mostly doing the business as usual at the cost of locally led adaptation. They are trying to address the hazards than the vulnerability. There is a serious gap in understanding vulnerability and also to differentiate what is the difference between hazard and vulnerability. So as the AR6 has, the IPCC AR6 has very clearly mentioned that the vulnerability is the intersection of inequality, livelihoods, and poverty. But if we see the vulnerability analysis in our countries, it is mostly to address the hazards and physical hazards. So these are my critical findings based on my research, and I would like to know what is the situation in Africa, because I have never done any research in Africa. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name is Laila Darawih. I'm from Germany, working on adaptation, more on M&E on adaptation. My question was to WRI for on the part where you talked about studying also projects from GCF and AF and others, and you mentioned that they didn't meet the expectations with regards to results. Can you elaborate a bit more on what was the problem with regard in this aspect? Was it lacking climate rationale? Was it inadequate indicators that they used, or something else? And then I wanted to ask from AFDB on the depth for adaptation swaps, if there are already some countries working on it. Maybe WRI is also able to respond on that, but yeah, maybe we can also.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Cher Fadel Wad. Donc, où est le gars là? C'est bon? Oh, voilà, d'accord. Je m'appelle Cher Fadel Wad, donc je suis sénégalais. Je suis le directeur exécutif de l'ONG Solidarité Sissotoura. Vraiment, j'ai beaucoup aimé participer à ce side event parce que WWF intervient au niveau de l'Afrique, mais surtout au niveau du Sénégal, dans ma localité. Ils ont accompagné les communautés là-bas pour l'adaptation. Nous savons tous qu'en Afrique, nous avons des problèmes d'adaptation. Mais aujourd'hui, WWF n'est plus au Sénégal. Et il avait vraiment beaucoup accompagné ces communautés. Je ne sais pas ce qui a arrêté ce partenariat, mais quand même, vraiment, nous tendons nos bras pour dire que vous étiez en train de faire du bon boulot au niveau de l'Afrique, au niveau du Sénégal, et ces communautés qui ont besoin d'adaptation, de s'adapter, qui ont besoin d'être résilients. Vraiment, nous lançons toujours un appel pour que ce partenariat puisse continuer, parce que vous avez semé quelque chose qui a porté ses fruits en Afrique et surtout dans ma communauté. Je vous remercie.
So I'm going to translate what he said. So his name is Ouad. He's coming from Senegal. He's very happy to be in this site event. He appreciates WF work in Senegal. WF used to be present in Senegal, and WF did a lot in his community in Senegal in terms of adaptation. So he's trying to call out for WF to come back to Senegal and work on adaptation again. Thank you.
Maybe the last question I will try to take is basically, well, I'm not the right person to respond, but definitely some of our big bosses are around, so we can ask our big boss to go back to Senegal and work more on adaptation. But I believe there will be some of the project that is ongoing over there. And just to mention that Henry is not with the WRI, he's with the UNEP. So that's perfectly fine, but maybe Henry can give some of his remarks, some of the question that has been raised.
Yes, so indeed, UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. So it's a part of UNEP, but not exactly UNEP. We're like their think tank. Anyway, let me start with your question first because it's easier and sort of more confined. Why was the outcome of half of these projects, roughly half of these projects, give or take a few, not as expected in terms of the results, nor in terms of their sustainability? And as I tried to explain, we did not look at that answer to the degree that we could say exactly what the main causes were. I mean, this was like terminal evaluations of these projects. We're still in early days in terms of being able to evaluate adaptation projects ex post. It's only been 15 years since the Jeff came on board, the Adaptation Fund. It takes a while to make proposals, to get them started, to finalize them, and then it takes more time even to be able to assess their outcomes. So, you know, we're thinking of lagged information here. I think one explanation might be that early projects, particularly of these funds, may not have been as well developed as they currently are. I think they are improving. There's a stronger focus on the development of these projects, but we will see that as things move forward, and the number of projects that we can assess, both the final, the terminal evaluations, but also more importantly, ex-post or long-term ex-post impact assessments. So I'm not sure I can answer that question as needed. As I said from before, adaptation practice is poor. That's also based on a qualitative assessment that we did in 2022 in the Adaptation Gap Report. So if you have a look at that, it says a lot about the reasons why adaptation projects aren't working as well as they should. And I already laid out a number of reasons why, you know, like not paying attention to future climate change, not involving local organizations, the partners they're working with on the ground, not being adaptive in the management, not having accountability and monitoring and evaluation, and also fundamentally not looking at the bottom line of building resilience, like raising the ship of everybody against not only climate risks, but essentially increasing development, which improves resilience. So these are just a number of reasons. So now to your question from Nepal, and the idea that not even concessional loans should be made available to the poorest, but it should be entirely grant financed, and that the second point was about access, particularly to local and national partners in the development process. So on the grant question, I think I'm a bit torn. I think that grants need to increase. The funding needs to increase, but grants are ultimately always public sector investments. And while they are the only model where the beneficiary basically doesn't have to pay back parts of the investment, highly concessional loans and a number of instruments that enable the private sector in particular to engage in adaptation are needed, and whether that involves some sorts of paying back for services, that's also not doable with a grant. So you need more instruments, more diverse instruments to address the problems that developing nations face, and the populations on the ground, they will have to pay for some services. If it's better in water quality or health, oftentimes that comes at a cost. I'm not sure it's possible to do everything with grants. While I think that grants are needed and more important, and it needs to be highly concessional at least. Access and making things, around social and environmental justice. So the question of justice, I think, is critical to adaptation. That is bringing the local partners into the game. That has something to do with justice. So climate justice is fundamental to adaptation effectiveness. So you might want to separate that. In my definition of effectiveness, social justice, environmental justice are core. That is what makes things effective. If you don't have it, it's not going to be effective. You're not going to have long-term success. So when we talk about adaptation effectiveness, I mean, some don't agree, but I mean it includes justice elements, fundamentally. And lastly, the point about access of local organizations, I am totally with you on that. It is very difficult for donors, the Global North, and even funds to support local organizations which oftentimes do not have the accountability and processing instruments in place. They have difficulties reporting to the support provided, and I think there need to be ways to overcome these challenges. Maybe there is a possibility of pooling, and you provide some kind of intermediary organization that enables the engagement with local organizations that just don't have the capacity to report back to their to the donors or the funders more generally. And I think that is a problem, because these local organizations, they know what needs to happen. They are very cost effective. They are rooted in the social fabric of the partners on the ground. They are ideal partners, but it's often hard for the funder to know it's not a scam. That also exists. There are plenty of examples where local organizations are, like scammers are just taking benefit of the finance made available, and nobody sees a dime at the end of the day. So how do you overcome this problem of lack of accountability on the one hand, and trying to bring in, well-meaning and capable local organizations. And that is knowledge. You need to know who you're working with. And I think building something around public inventories and sorry, the word escapes me, but ways through which local organizations can show that they are credible without having to undergo these very strict reporting conditions and requirements would be a huge step forward.
Well, thank you so much, Henry. I think we are running away of time, so maybe I would like to close this session by saying 3 words that take away for me in the climate change adaptation space. Firstly, is about what Henry mentioned about the innovative and effectiveness. I think that's really critical. Second is more on the dialogue. We really need to have a dialogue between all parties, key stakeholders, and thirdly more the transformative approaches. So we need to not have a project on the transformative, but also our thinking also needs to be transformative. So with that, on the note, thank you so much for being a great audience, and also thank you so much, Henry, and for your insights. So let's give a round of applause to him, and please do hang around. We have many other, I would say, side event over years, and we look forward to seeing each other and having great dialogue. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Henry. Great to see you. Great to meet you.